My daughter took my social security check and ran off to the beach, leaving me alone with no food, and when she came back sun-kissed and smiling she expected to find me begging for help, but instead she opened the refrigerator to make herself dinner and screamed in horror at what she saw inside. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin the story of betrayal and the day I finally chose myself, I ask you to support this channel by subscribing, liking the video and sharing in the comments the city or country you're listening from, because it warms my spirit to know how many of us there are. 3 hours earlier the front door had slammed shut, yet the heavy sugary scent of Quintessa's perfume still hung in the hallway, far too loud for our old brownstone that usually smelled of dust, age and dried lavender, and I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the pantry door while the silence pressed in on me, no longer peaceful but predatory, my stomach twisting with hunger. I was ashamed to admit the simple human kind that grows sharper by evening. When I opened the cabinet, the shelves were spotless and terrifyingly empty, evidence of her hurried packing as she'd flitted around like a tropical bird, tossing bikinis and sundresses into her suitcase, and I remembered how she paused at the door already in her shoes and held out her hand asking for my card, just in case, dismissing my fear when I told her it was my entire social security check and sneering that I had grits and butter and should consider it a detox because at my age I didn't need to invent problems. Then she was gone and I was left with nothing but silence, hunger, and the slow realization that something inside me had finally snapped. She said she deserved the vacation and walked out without looking back, flying off to Miami for sunshine, drinks and beach photos, taking my money, my peace of mind, and as I soon discovered, my food with her. She had mentioned grits so casually that I went to the top shelf where the old glass jar sat, labeled in my handwriting from decades ago, but the moment I lifted it I knew something was wrong because it was almost empty, with only a few dusty grains left at the bottom, not enough to feed anyone, which meant she had either lied or never cared to check. Brushing aside my fear just to quiet me before calling her ride and forgetting about me completely, and the cold that settled in my chest wasn't from the room but from the realization that the child I raised with love had crossed from selfishness into cruelty. I put the jar back and began searching for spare change in her room, which was a mess of clothes, makeup and scattered papers, until I found a crumpled travel receipt showing she had spent 3 full months of my benefits on her beach escape. And standing there in the dim light, I thought about all the years I had repaired old clothes, skipped small comforts, and saved every extra dollar for her shoes, her education, her wants, only to walk back into a living room filled with expensive furniture, fine dishes, silver sets, and used jewelry and fur coats worth more than I could ever imagine spending. And in that quiet glow from the streetlights, I understood the truth at last. This wasn't a home anymore, it was a showroom of things saved for a future that never came, a museum built around her comfort, while I stood inside it hungry, forgotten, and finally awake. I realized then that I wasn't the mistress of the house at all but an unpaid curator, shuffling around in worn slippers, dusting exhibits, slowly starving so that one day someone else could arrive and take everything without even saying thank you. And as my stomach growled again, the feeling that rose in me wasn't anger but something colder and sharper, clarity. So clear it felt like ice, and I moved to the coffee table where old newspapers lay stacked, the same ones Quintessa mocked as trash. Knowing that hidden in their classified pages was something I had noticed weeks earlier and pretended I'd never need, I found the faint red circle around the ad offering house calls for antiques and silver, stared at the phone, whispered a bitter joke about grits, and dialed the number slowly as if cracking open a safe that held my life. And when Mr. Alistair Sterling answered, polite and professional, I surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded as I asked about selling early 20th century sterling silver flatware, telling him I wanted to sell it the very next day. And when he arrived precisely at 9, slicing the silence with the doorbell, I let him in without ceremony, watched his appraising eyes take in the heavy furniture and fine pieces, and corrected him when he called it a home, telling him it was only storage, before opening the velvet-lined case to reveal 12 unused silver spoons engraved with my grandparents' monograms, spoons Quintessa once dreamed of using for her wedding anniversaries but had abandoned without a thought. And as Mr. Sterling examined them with gloved hands, murmuring about their rarity and condition, I finally understood that these objects had never been meant to serve a future that excluded me. And for the first time in years, someone looked at what I owned, and at me, with genuine respect. That he explained that the silver was rare and valuable, not the kind of piece that should ever be reduced to scrap. And then he named a price that stunned me. It equaled 5 months of my checks, and a month earlier I would have accepted it without question, hidden the money away and felt grateful just to survive. But something inside me had shifted, years of careful bargaining at fabric stalls rising up, and I looked him in the eye and calmly said no, repeating his own words about the early period set, flawless and complete, and telling him plainly that he would resell it for far more, that I wasn't asking for full market value, only a fair dealer's price, naming a number 40% higher, which made him smile with surprise before agreeing. And when he left with the case, I stood there holding the cash, my heart racing not from fear but from a new sense of strength, feeling lighter than I had in years. So instead of hiding the money, I put on my best coat and walked downtown to a market I hadn't entered in over a decade, where I bought good bread still warm, fine meats, rich cheeses, olives ripe, peaches that smelled like summer, and smoked salmon glowing like sunset. And when I returned home with those simple treasures, I laid out a beautiful white tablecloth I'd been told never to touch, used the finest plate from the cabinet, and said softly to the quiet room that today I was the guest, finally allowing myself dignity, comfort, and the right to live well. That I set the table with care, using a silver fork I still had, along with matching knives and dessert spoons, since only the small spoons were gone, and I arranged the food slowly, rolling the ham neatly, cutting the cheese into small pieces, placing olives, salmon, and warm bread I broke by hand, letting crumbs fall freely. Then I took a bite of the peach and felt the sweet juice on my lips, realizing this wasn't just about eating but about finally feeling seen, valued, and alive. So I ate without rushing, enjoying every bite with hot black tea. And as I looked at the empty wall where the calendar hung, it dawned on me that I had spent years waiting for appreciation that never came, because sacrifice is rarely honored and often taken for granted. And when I finished and felt a calm fullness I hadn't known in a long time, I stood by the cabinet where the silver case once rested and placed the market receipt there instead, smiling at the reflection as if to say this simple meal mattered. And over the next days I woke with the sun, enjoyed fresh breakfasts, and one evening while relaxing with a glass of good wine the phone rang, and I knew it was my daughter, her voice loud with false concern and control, assuming I was struggling. But instead of explaining myself as I once would have, I answered calmly, speaking of finding resources, letting her laugh and dismiss me while I sat quietly confident, knowing she believed I was waiting helplessly for her return, while in truth I had already reclaimed my independence, my dignity, and my plans for a life that finally belonged to me. I picked up the notebook beside the phone and noticed an appointment already written there for the next day at exactly 11 with Mr. Lister, because I had planned to sell the large oak wardrobe in the hallway, the one that blocked the passage and constantly caught my sleeves, an antique piece that was valuable but heavy, dark, and unpleasant to live with. Yet after speaking with Quintessa I changed my mind, realizing that selling the wardrobe would be noisy and tiring, and instead I wanted something more graceful and meaningful. So I walked into the bedroom and opened a smaller jewelry box where a gold brooch rested, shaped like a delicate branch with tiny diamonds and a deep red stone in the center. A piece Quintessa loved and wore freely as if it already belonged to her, just as she treated the apartment and even me. And as I held it in my hand I remembered fixing its clasp years ago without thanks. And when Mr. Lister arrived right on time the next morning, I told him I had chosen a different item, watching his interest grow as he examined the brooch and explained its age and craftsmanship, naming a price that was more than generous, which I accepted without argument because I was ready to let it go. And as he packed it away and left, I felt no regret, only relief. Then I called a restaurant I had admired from a distance for years and placed an order for a proper meal and a chilled bottle of celebration drink, smiling to myself as I realized that when Quintessa returned and searched for her favorite jewelry she would find nothing, while I would be quietly enjoying the freedom of knowing I had finally discovered my own strength and resources, not in the sofa but in my self-respect, which I had finally bought back, because although the champagne shimmered softly in my glass, the festive feeling vanished the moment I opened the bottom drawer of the secretary desk in search of the certificate for the old landscape painting in the living room, a piece Lister said would be worth more with proper papers. And instead of documents I found years of useless receipts, broken appliance warranties and clutter Quintessa had stuffed there, until my fingers caught a bright red plastic folder that was clearly not mine, and inside it lay a glossy brochure for Restful Meadow State Facility for Veterans and Seniors, a place I knew too well by reputation, whispered about as cold, careless, and forgotten, followed by a draft power of attorney, bearing my name and Quintessa's, granting her control over my property and medical decisions with a penciled date set for next month after her return. And in that instant the truth struck me with brutal clarity. This was not neglect but a plan, a calculated decision to remove me quietly, sell my home and possessions, and leave me to fade away in a government ward while she enjoyed the profits. And though no tears came, a fierce, steady rage took their place, sharpening my resolve, so I shoved the folder back into the drawer as a reminder and immediately called Mr. Sterling, ordering him to return with a truck because I was selling everything. The painting, the clock, the rug, the silver, all of it. And within hours he arrived with help and my life was carried out piece by piece. The painting leaving a pale scar on the wall, the grandfather clock silenced after 50 years, the rug rolled away, and as the rooms emptied, I felt lighter with every item removed, as if they were not taking furniture, but lifting the weight that had been pressing on my soul for far too long. The apartment was slowly turning into a bright open space that finally felt like it belonged to me, no longer a stiff museum but a real home. And as Alistair wrote checks and counted the cash, the amount grew so large it felt unreal for someone living on a pension, which made him quietly ask if I might regret this later. And I answered honestly while staring at the bare wall that I would regret only one thing, that I hadn't done it sooner. When the door closed behind the movers, I stood alone in the echoing hallway holding a bag full of money and didn't hesitate for a second. I called a cleaning company and ordered a full deep cleaning that same day, asking for windows, walls, and floors to shine and smell fresh, not old, then opened the website of a high-end food boutique and filled my cart freely with fine items, confirming same-day delivery without even checking the total. By evening, the apartment glowed with clean air and warm sunset light, flowers filled the room, and couriers arrived with heavy boxes that went straight into my old refrigerator, which had never seen such abundance. Rows of jars, rich cheeses, fruits I'd only seen in pictures, and bottles carefully laid out until every shelf was full and weighed down. When they left, I opened the fridge once more and looked at it quietly, breathing in the cool air that smelled of comfort and choice instead of scarcity, understanding that this fullness was my answer and my protection, a clear sign that I was no longer waiting to be pushed aside. And as I closed the door, the soft click felt final. 2 quiet weeks passed, and then right at noon, I heard a key turn in the lock while I sat calmly in the kitchen, sipping my drink with my back to the hallway, completely unafraid. I held no tea but real Darjeeling, tart and fragrant, in a thin, almost transparent cup, and I didn't flinch as the door crashed open and the smells of street heat and airplane fuel rushed in with Quintessa's triumphant voice announcing her return and demanding an apology before she even crossed the threshold. She rolled her suitcase inside, expecting the familiar gloom, the odor of medicine, and me rushing forward in submission, but instead she froze, confused by the scent of fresh lilies, the trace of sandalwood and jasmine, and the strange spaciousness where the heavy rug and the grandfather clock used to be. Suspicion crept into her voice as she stepped farther in, brushing off the unease and declaring her hunger. Then she marched into the kitchen, dropping her purse and talking over me as if I were invisible, certain she would find an empty refrigerator and another reason to scold. I stayed still, set my cup down with a quiet clink, and as she reached for the fridge and yanked it open, the light flared and she let out a sharp cry of shock, stumbling back from the sight of it. Shelves packed tight with her so-called inheritance, rows of gleaming blue tins of the rarest black caviar and below them chilled bottles of vintage Dom Perignon staring back at her in cold, undeniable silence. The wheels of blue cheese lay wrapped in craft paper like hidden treasures. Truffles gleamed like gemstones in their glass flasks. Dragon fruit blushed bright pink, mangoes glowed yellow, mangosteen purple. A riot of color this kitchen had never seen. The fridge door, usually home to ketchup and mayonnaise, now crammed with Belgian chocolates and jars of foie gras, groaned under the weight of abundance. A feast during a plague. But the plague had been poverty, now banished. Quintessa stood frozen, hands pressed to her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. Her gaze darted from caviar to champagne, from truffles to exotic fruits, refusing to compute what she saw. A pensioner supposed to be boiling grits, now had a fridge fit for an emir. What is this?" she squeaked, her voice breaking. Her trembling hand touched a cold jar of caviar, testing its reality. "Mama, where from?" she whispered, her tan fading to a dull, dirty stain. I turned slowly, calm and steady. "I was hungry, Quintessa. You took my card. I had to improvise." She snatched a jar as if it were a grenade, clinking it against her rings. "What does this mean? Where did you get the money? Did you steal? Alone? Do you know the interest? Her panic overtook her as she dashed around the kitchen, eyes wild. Then realization struck. The emptiness. She charged into the living room, opening drawers, screaming, holding the empty velvet case for the spoons. Where is the silver? The ruby brooch? The clock? Her gaze swept the bare walls, the empty corner, the missing rug. We've been robbed. Someone must have come in. Call the police. I placed my cup back on the saucer. Like, the sound cut through her hysteria like ice. No police, Quintessa. My voice was quiet, deliberate. Her face twisted. What do you mean? Everything is gone, millions worth. I met her gaze steadily. Nobody stole anything. I sold it. Her phone slipped from her hands, thudding against the floor. Sold it, she repeated, voice barely audible, alien. To whom? Why? I told you. I was hungry. I stood, picked up the jar of caviar, feeling its cool weight. You took my check, left me an empty grits jar, and a person needs to eat. So I decided to have your brooch for breakfast, on toast with butter. It all finally made sense to her, and I could almost see the thoughts grinding together as the empty walls, the overflowing refrigerator, and my calm posture formed one clear picture in her mind. Shock melted into anger, then into the pain of realizing what she believed she had lost, and she stared at the jar in my hand not as food but as her future life turned into a simple meal. She stepped toward me, accusing and trembling, saying I had consumed her inheritance and destroyed what she thought was hers, but I only smiled and reminded her that she had never cared for those things, only waited for them to fall into her hands. When she shouted about memories and family history, I calmly answered that they were only objects, and they had finally served their purpose by taking care of the one who actually lived there. Panicking, she rushed to the refrigerator, grabbing jars and bottles, insisting she could still turn them back into money, clinging to them like a desperate child, until I stopped her with a firm voice she had never heard from me before. I told her clearly that she had no money left, that she had already spent it, and that the food in this house now belonged to me. Slowly, furious and shaken, she put everything back, muttering threats and accusing me of being unwell, then stormed out to make frantic phone calls, convinced she could still control the situation. I stayed where I was, unafraid, opened the jar she had just held and calmly tasted its contents, knowing that for the first time in years, I was no longer the one being judged or managed. Miss Theodosia appeared at the door looking startled, saying she thought there must be an emergency because of all the shouting, and Quintessa immediately pulled her inside, insisting she was a witness to what she called my breakdown. She loudly claimed I had sold everything in the apartment, spent the money on food, and clearly didn't understand my own actions, begging the neighbor to agree that something was wrong with me. When they entered the kitchen, they didn't find a confused or careless woman, but me sitting calmly at the table, neatly dressed, composed, and enjoying a simple meal, looking more put together than I had in years. Miss Theodosia froze, clearly surprised, while I greeted her politely, offered her tea, and even invited her to sit, which only made Quintessa more upset as she kept repeating that wasting money on good food proved I had lost control. At that moment, Mr. Sterling stepped in and calmly explained that every sale had been done properly, with documents and official confirmation that I was fully aware and capable, leaving no room for argument. As Quintessa scanned the papers, her confidence collapsed, while Miss Theodosia quietly pointed out the truth, that I had spent my whole life sacrificing and finally chose to live with dignity. With no one supporting her accusations, Quintessa stood there frustrated and exposed, realizing she had no authority left, and though she warned me bitterly about the future, I remained steady, knowing that for the first time, my choices were truly my own. When Quintessa spat that she would make my life hell and turned to leave, convinced her presence was still her final weapon, I stopped her with a calm word and quietly pulled from the drawer the red brochure for Restful Meadow and the draft. Power of attorney she had hidden, watching the color drain from her face as she realized I knew everything. I told her I had found them while looking for loose change, laid the papers on the table, and named her plan without anger, selling the house, taking the money, and locking me away to rot in a state facility, until even Miss Theodosia gasped and Mr. Sterling looked at her with open disgust. When Quintessa tried to stammer excuses, I cut her off, placed the brochure back into her hand, and told her to keep it for herself because she would no longer live here. I informed her the locks had been changed, her suitcase was already packed, and that while she could threaten police or court, She had nowhere to go and witnesses to her cruelty. Faced with all of us standing firm, she grabbed her suitcase, hurled curses and stormed out, leaving behind a silence that felt clean and final. After the door locked with a steady click, I calmly returned the warm jar of caviar to the refrigerator, whispering that cold is tastier, knowing that ahead of me lay not fear or hunger, but my own quiet evening and the beginning of a life that finally belonged to me. I held a small tray with a hot cup of coffee and a sandwich on a crunchy baguette, thick with cream cheese and layered with red fish, while a new soft wool shawl in warm terracotta rested on my shoulders like a long-missed embrace. I had bought it with money from selling an old fur coat I'd saved for decades, only to discover it had been ruined by moths, and it struck me how I had once gone hungry just to preserve something that was quietly falling apart anyway, a circle I finally chose to break. I settled into a wicker chair, knowing Quintessa was truly gone from my life now, fading like a bad dream after her calls, threats, and tears ended the moment I told her one more word would make me sell the apartment and live freely by the sea. A warning she believed because the apartment was the last thing she hoped to claim. The space around me felt new and honest, no heavy furniture, no dark corners, just light, air and a few things I genuinely loved, and for the first time I wasn't a caretaker of objects but the true owner of my own home. I picked up a travel brochure showing mountains and hot springs and realized I could afford a full month there, turning old silver and unwanted rugs into memories instead of dust. As I bit into the sandwich, the familiar taste surprised me, rich and grounding, reminding me of jewelry I once kept locked away out of fear instead of joy, and I understood that now I was finally allowing myself to live fully. The coffee was strong and warm, and as I smiled into the autumn sun, I felt something settle inside me, a quiet certainty that my life, my choices and my days belonged to me alone, and that this simple bite taken in peace and self-respect was the most satisfying one I had ever known.